One of the major issues facing Peru today is poverty, as around 1.2 million citizens, or around 3.8% of the population, lives in extreme poverty, as found by a 2016 study. The international extreme poverty line is defined by the United Nations as living on the equivalent of $2.15 or less a day. Even on the basis of the Peruvian national poverty line, around 20.2% of the population was found to be living in standard poverty per a 2019 World Bank report. However, the case of poverty in Peru differs from surrounding countries in South America and beyond, in that Peru has been in a period of sustained economic growth for the past 2 decades, that according to the World Bank was well above the average for the region. From 2007 to 2019, the percentage of the population living in moderate poverty declined by a whopping 22.2%. Despite this, there's a specific and unique challenge facing Peru as the nation attempts to close the socioeconomic gap. The difference in the effect of poverty, and in turn the challenge of reducing it between indigenous and non-indigenous ethnic groups. The split in Peru comes between the group of people with Spanish heritage and those descended from Native American populations such as the Quechua or Aymara. The effects of colonialism and the destruction of indigenous culture and society still creates a major gap in the well-being between these two groups, even hundreds of years later. In 2009, UNICEF found that 78% of children who spoke Quechua or Aymara as a first language, thus representing these native groups, lived in poverty. Comparatively, only 40% of those who spoke Spanish as a first language lived in poverty. This means that indigenous children are almost twice as likely to face poverty than their Spanish-descended counterparts. Therefore, the global political challenge I will be looking at today is poverty, and the research question that I will be examining is to what extent the disparities in levels of poverty between the ethnic groups of Peru has led to the deprivation of human rights, and what has been done and can be done to address this. There are 3 areas of poverty and related human rights issues in Peru that I will investigate today. Those being the lack of equality in education, the disparity in political power, and the development of strategies to minimize the socioeconomic struggles of the indigenous people. Starting with the lack of equality in education. It's important to note that access to free and equal education is a human right. Human rights are the inherent and inalienable rights all people of the world are granted, and are generally agreed to be laid out in the United Nations 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Furthermore, this document states that all rights must be provided equally among all people. Following this, it is the duty and obligation of the Peruvian government to provide free and fair access to education for all citizens, regardless of ethnicity. However, the Borgen Project, a non-governmental organization designed for reducing poverty, finds that rural poverty in Peru has roots in high rates of illiteracy, specifically caused by a lack of education in the rural areas of Peru. Now, the rural areas of Peru are the areas in which the indigenous people are most likely to live. Peru is a country that has a heavy geographical split. In the cities, this is where most of the Spanish-descended people live, and in the rural areas, which tend to be in the Andes Mountains or the Amazon rainforest areas, this is where the indigenous communities live. The effect of living in these separated communities means that they have less access to institutions such as education and less schools. A further challenge provided is that since many of these children don't speak the nationally agreed upon language of Spanish, they aren't able to be taught in their native language. So either they're forced to forfeit their right to education or are forced to give up their indigenous and culture to learn Spanish and be taught in this language. This is a deprivation of their human right. Once again, going back to the document, it is stated that the government must provide free and equal education to all citizens. But one of the major causes and effects, both of poverty in Peru, is that indigenous people do not have the same access to adequate education as their non-indigenous counterparts. The result of this is the mass migration out of the rural areas to bigger cities. The International Monetary Fund writes that moving to urban areas crucially improves access to education services. But this also further causes the loss of indigenous culture. The second point also draws from this and is the disparity in political power. Power is defined as the ability of individuals to effect change and impose their will on the world around them. An essential area of power in a democratic country is voting power. Another right laid out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is that the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of the government. This will shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections. Now, while Peru is a democratic country that does have elections, they are not always free and fair. And this is because there is disparity in political power from indigenous and non-indigenous people. Indigenous people have traditionally a far lower rate of access to voting and voting rights than the non-indigenous groups. Maritza Paredes, a professor at the University of Oxford, writes that in the state of Peru, in different states of Peru, indigenous people feel alienated from their own government. This is because historically, being a minority in certain areas, their votes have not counted. And this means that over time, the rate of voting among this demographic has declined. Furthermore, this ties into the same issue as I laid out in my first point, which is that in living in rural areas, they often have to face long journeys through difficult terrain, as the majority of Peru is either mountainous or thickly forested, to reach voting sites, the same issue that they have when trying to reach proper educational sites. In 2008 report by the University of Oxford, it was found that indigenous people had almost half the voter turnout of non-indigenous and Hispanic counterparts. So there's a movement of political groups to raise the voter turnout and in turn raise the political power of indigenous groups. And this is going to tie again into my third point, which is the development in reducing these inequalities. But first, it's important to look at these different perspectives of groups. So first we have the AIDESEP, which is the Interethnic Association for the Development of the Peruvian Jungle. So this is referring to the Amazon rainforest, which takes up a massive part of Peru, almost 60%. So this group defends the collective rights of the indigenous people of Peru and represents over 64 different groups. The problem with this is that since it's only one group, and it is an organization that tends to work with the government, so it's a coalition of people trying to get voting rights. But the issue is because it has to so broadly generalize for all these different indigenous groups, it doesn't always adequately meet the necessities of the people that it's trying to serve. There are also non-governmental organizations, such as the Movement in the Amazon for Tribal Subsistence and Economic Sustainability, that focus both on preserving indigenous culture and trying to lower the economic gap in poverty between these two groups. So the aim of these organizations are to build the proper institutions to serve the indigenous people, which is providing more access to voting centers and education. So once again, this ties into my third point, which is the development in reducing the inequalities. So development in global politics can be defined as the sustained increase in the standard of living and well-being for the people of the country. So this, in this case, would be referring to both reducing poverty and increasing adequate support for human rights. So UNICEF Peru invested more than 14 million United States dollars to improve intercultural and bilingual education in schools across Peru. So this is an essential right, as I said in my first point, so it's important that this group is funding. So this shows the necessity of international groups such as UNICEF, which is derived from the United Nations, in providing supports for developing areas of developing nations. There's also groups like the Forest Alliance, which is a non-government group working throughout South America to preserve indigenous land site. Furthermore, the United States has also played an essential role in developing human rights in Peru for indigenous people, as the United States Agency for International Development has created the Peruvian and Indigenous Community Program, which tries to expand university access and levels of higher education. The idea being that if there can be created a more educated populace in Peru, they can be less dependent on international support and work internally to build sustained infrastructure for supporting human rights. So overall, the three areas that I looked at was the lack of equality in education, the disparity in political power, and then attempts for creating economic and social development within the country. So overall, going back to my research question, which is to what extent the disparities in levels of poverty between the ethnic groups of Peru lead to the deprivation of human rights, and what has been done and can be done to address this, it's clear that disparities in levels of poverty have had a massive and undeniable effect on the deprivation of human rights, critically the rights of fair and free elections, education, and equality. But there has been significant efforts in the recent years by both non-governmental organizations, intergovernmental organizations, and internal governmental groups to lower these disparities. So we can see this as almost a case study that can be applied to the rest of South America as an example of lowering disparities between ethnic groups, specifically indigenous and non-indigenous. Thank you.